Cross-pollination. As you can see, this is using a vector in the form of a bee. Pollen from the stamens will stick to the legs, usually the pollen sacs, on an insect, and as they move from flower to flower, they will transfer the pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the next. Now it is important to note that you can see here these are two daffodil flowers. It would not be possible for the bee to transfer daffodil pollen, say, to a tulip flower and for pollination to occur in fertilization. They have to be within the same species. The advantages of cross-pollination is it greatly increases the genetic diversity in the offspring. Of course, those gametes, those ovules and that pollen will have been produced by meiosis, which we know already brings about genetic variation. To that effect, many plants have actually come up with adaptations to prevent self-pollination, which of course reduces the genetic diversity and the gene pool, which can leave them more susceptible to genetic diseases, or indeed in form of any diseases, can leave them at the mercy of the elements. Some strategies plants have taken on board to prevent self-pollination is you can actually, most flowers are hermaphroditic, i.e. they have both male and female parts, but some species have developed to become either male or female plants, so the stigmas and anthers are on different plants. Another strategy is some species have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. Stigma and anther are often placed far away from each other, so often it'll be the case that the stigma is raised above the anther, so it's very difficult for the pollen to actually move upwards. However, if the stigma was located below it, of course the wind or an insect or an animal could brush off it and the pollen could drop onto it. Another strategy to prevent self-pollination is the stigma and the anthers often mature at different times of the year. And finally, some plants, in fact many plants, the stigma contains chemicals that only allow pollen from other plants to grow those pollen tubules to enable fertilization to take place. You can see there are some very obvious indicators whether it is an insect or wind pollinated plant, with insect pollinated plants usually being very, very bright, often have a fragrance or smell to attract any pollinators, and likewise they often have nectaries as well at the base of the plant, so the insects have to delve really deep into the plant to access that sugary sap, and in doing so brush off the anthers. On the other hand, wind-pollinated plants tend to be quite drab in colour. Their strategy is not to invest in lots of colour or scent, but indeed to produce more and more pollen. So they produce a lot more pollen because, of course, a lot of it is wasted as it's caught by the wind, and the likelihood of it meeting another wind-pollinated stigma is very low. So therefore, their strategy is to invest energy in that instead of scents, a smell, a nectar, and of course beautiful coloration. As we mentioned in the previous video, once the pollen grain, the nucleus, reaches the ovule, and it is important to emphasize the nucleus, well then fertilization takes place, and a response to this causes the petals of the flower and the sepals begin to wither away. The stamens, stigma and style also wither away, and we end up getting a swelling in the ovary, as you can see here. This is really important. So the ovary begins to swell. You can see this whole region here begins to swell and becomes the fruit, and there's all the ovary wall, and we get the ovules within that will begin to become the seeds. Now most flowers and the ovary will become fleshy or succulent, often as we regard as a fruit, but some can become hard and dry and can form nuts. Of course, the main function of this is to try and encourage some form of dispersal. Ultimately, you want to move your fertilized seeds as far away from the parent plant as possible to try and minimize or reduce the likelihood of competition and for resources such as light, minerals, space, and water. I mentioned an apple before, which is actually the swollen ovary, and you can see here these are the ovules covered in an tough outer coating called a testa, which we'll see later on is very important. It's very hard to break down, so if it was consumed by an animal, the seeds could be dispersed further away from the parent plant as the animal passes the seeds out or poops it out in its feces, and it can resist digestion in the stomach and throughout the digestive system. So it's very, very important. The word pistil is used there. I'm sorry. Often we use the term, it's part of the carpel that has the stigma and the style region. The main vectors involved in the dispersal of seeds are wind, water, and animals, and we can see there's a couple of examples of which we'll touch upon. So this is a coconut which uses water as its main medium to move the seed away from the parent plant. This is also another very familiar one. We have this bright yellow flower, which is our dandelion. When pollination takes place, it forms these dandelion clocks, which are caught by the wind and can be transported great distances, and each little one will have a seed attached at the end, and then it has these little feathery parts to catch the wind, which makes it very well adapted